times like this, when things are breaking down, that we get massive amounts of change. It goes back to Vladimir Lenin's quote of days or decades where nothing seems to happen. Life doesn't change, but then there's days where decades seem to happen. And that's where we're at. And I say that quote all the time. But it's this disruptive change that leads to this, which of course is why like Klaus Schwab wrote the book, COVID-19, The Great Reset. He was like, in this time, this pandemic, it's time to reimagine, reset. And so they want to use these times. And we got something else coming in right now. Of course, as the banking system is collapsing, and the Fed is moving in to, reassure depositors that their money is safe, that the banking system is okay. It seems like they're also pushing some secret agendas through. What am I talking about? Well, I've been warning you. Lots of people are warning you. Take heed that central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are coming to a country near you. Now, we know China has pushed their CBDC out. I've talked about that extensively. But of course they have, because they're a communist country. I've played you clips of the head of the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, is like the central bank above all the central banks. The head of the BIS, Augustin Carson, he says that central bank digital currencies would not be like cash. With cash, you can move cash around and we don't know what it is. But with central bank digital currencies, we will have total control. We'll know every single transaction. And that's what they want. But of course, getting it through in China, in a communist country, it's communist, right? Getting it through the EU, it's almost communist, right? But what about in America? What about in the land of the free? What about in the United States? Now, we have something, this pesky document called the Constitution that seems to get in the way every time these authoritarian leaders want to try to push something through like this. And it basically restricts what the Federal Reserve can do. It's the government that creates money, right? The Federal Reserve just controls monetary policy. And so to have a central bank digital currency where we have an account with the Fed, it's not really how things are done. But don't let these pesky laws get in their way. They're going to get their way through. And so how do we get there? The old analogy of how you'd catch a wild pig would be you'd put like a little bit of corn on the ground every day. And every day you'd put the corn, and then the pig would come and eat the corn. And then one day there would be like one wall up. And then the pig would still come. And then another day there'd be like a second wall up. And then the pig would still come. And then eventually there's a third wall up. And the pig comes every day. And finally that fourth and final wall goes in. And so it's this path of leading us there. And so one thing that's a little bit too coincidental for me is that we're having a couple things going on. So obviously the banking crisis I've talked about extensively. Go back and listen to the last week if you want the deep dive intensive on what's going on. Also on my main YouTube channel, Mark Moss, I've been breaking that down in depth. But rather than try to rehash what happened, I don't want to go through that. But basically, a couple of banks got into trouble. They had to be bailed out by the Fed. And basically, the government and the Federal Reserve are saying that forget this FDIC thing because your limit's only $250,000. We're just going to backstop all the deposits. So even if you have over the uninsured amount, we're going to cover that anyway. Then they're talking about backstopping every deposit in the banking system, which is $18 trillion. Now, if the Fed backstops all the deposits, that sort of means that I have an account with the Fed. Now, there's a lot of steps that get us to this central bank digital currency, but ultimately it's a currency that's issued by the central bank. It's the Fed. Now, what about the digital part, Mark? Well, you might already be aware that over 80% of all dollar transactions are done digitally anyway. You probably use your debit card and your credit card and your Venmo and your PayPal and your wire transfers and your ACH and your direct deposits and your automatic bill pays. You probably already use all your money like that. Money is already digital. So we've already got the digital part. So all we need is the central bank part, right? We already got the digital part. We got the currency. We got the digital. And all we need left is the central bank part. But if the Fed backstops all the bank reserves, that effectively gives us an account with the Federal Reserve, and that is the part of the central bank digital currency. Now, but what about all the other stuff that you told us about, Mark? What about their ability to, control us and censor our transactions? Well, yeah, that's the danger with central bank digital currencies. They're programmable money, so they could program that money in advance, and they could say, hey, this group can do these things, this group can't. This group gets a positive interest rate, this group gets a negative interest rate. This group gets reparations, this group doesn't, things like that. This group, you've gone over your carbon allotment, you can't get gas or you can't eat steak, things like that. The thing is that they know that the American people will never go for that. As a matter of fact, there's massive pushback. We saw this week Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida is trying to pass legislation to prevent central bank digital currencies from working in Florida. We've seen Senator Ted Cruz in Texas trying to implement legislation to prevent the central bank digital currency from happening. So there's still some good people out there fighting the fight. And so they know that they can't just switch us to a central bank digital currency. Nobody's going to want that. You're waking up enough. You're spreading the news, and you should continue to do that. But what if we just sort of back in? We already have the currency, we already have the digital part, and now all we need is the account with the central bank or the Federal Reserve, and we're already there. So it's pretty interesting that this is the course of events that's happening, and at the same time as the Federal Reserve are shoring up dollar access for banks, the Federal Reserve announces, or I should say confirms, the launch of their own central bank digital currency. So they have there's a central bank digital currency coming out called FedNow. I've talked about this extensively. They announced it a while ago, but it just so happens that, of course, it's resurfaced right now. And basically, the FedNow is not as bad as you think it is yet. It's always the slippery slope. So the FedNow is a system that allows central banks and banks to move money back and forth between themselves using something like a CBDC. So it's not for the public yet. It's just for us to use internally. But you see how the pig analogy is working, how the walls are starting to close in? First, we start using digital money. And then second, the banks have a problem, so they give us accounts at the Fed. And then third, the Fed rolls out a central bank digital currency, but it's only for them, back channels between the banks. And then fourth, we just have accounts, our currencies directly with the Fed. And then finally, they start to add all those other behavioral modification programmable things into the money, because no one's going to go for it right off the bat. So it's pretty interesting. They announced this FedNow. It's launching. It says that, quote, early adopters will complete a customer testing and certification program informed by feedback from the FedNow pilot program to prepare for sending live transactions through the system. So it's been announced since 2019. They've been working on it, and now they're going to launch it. This is a big milestone. This is something to stay vigilant on. This is something to definitely pay attention to. Back the fighters, back Ron DeSantis, back Tom Emmer and Ted Cruz and all these people doing it, because they're inching this forward one way or another. We know what their ultimate goal is, and that is ultimate control. And so we have to be vigilant and watch out and stand for that.